Hey guys, it's Mrs. Ballant. We are here for Chapter 16, Lesson 3. Today you have 3 objectives. We're going to be talking about blood pressure today. We're going to talk about the difference between systolic and diastolic pressure, factors that influence blood pressure, and reasons why you should not get an odd number if you take a blood pressure manually. All right, so let's look here at blood pressures. So far we've talked about temperature, we've talked about pulse, and we've talked about respirations, and then we're gonna finish up with the vital signs, talking about blood pressure, and then tomorrow we'll finish up then with blood pressure and talk about some height and weight stuff as well. So what is blood pressure? When you measure someone's blood pressure, what you're actually measuring is the force that's being exerted as the heart pumps blood out into the arteries, and that force that's inside of the arteries. And when you take someone's blood pressure, you're actually taking 2 separate measurements. You're taking systolic and diastolic pressures. So when we get a blood pressure, we record it as a fraction. So you might get something like 120/70 or 100/60 or something similar to that. And those are actually 2 separate measurements. The top number is called the systolic pressure, and that is a measurement of how much pressure there is inside your arteries when your heart is at work. In other words, what is the pressure in your arteries when the heart's actually pumping the blood out to the arteries? The bottom number is called the diastolic pressure, and that is how much force is inside the arteries when your heart is at rest. In other words, how much pressure is in your arteries when the heart is just filling up with blood instead of actually doing work. And when we measure blood pressure, the units that we're measuring, or the unit of force that we're measuring, is millimeters of mercury. Now, there's some things that can influence someone's blood pressure. The first is cardiac output. In other words, how much blood is this person pumping out each minute or over a certain period of time. So that's going to affect the amount of force that can be exerted on the blood vessels. So that does greatly affect the blood pressure. How much blood volume you have. Have you lost a lot of blood due to a trauma or something like that? Do you have a condition maybe where you don't make enough blood? So all those kinds of things will influence someone's blood pressure. If there's resistance to blood flow, if the person has clogged arteries and a lot of buildup of fat in there, it's going to be harder to get that blood through and create more force than somebody who doesn't have that in their arteries. Their age will affect their blood pressure. Your blood pressure changes over time. Gender and race. They're African Americans, just based on their race, are actually more likely to develop hypertension. So looking there at the next slide, measuring blood pressure, there's actually 2 different ways that we can measure blood pressure that we talk about in this chapter. The first of which is manually, which we've already started learning how to do by watching the video on how to take blood pressure, and as you're practicing your skills. That is manually measuring someone's blood pressure. The kind of blood pressure that you just put the cuff on the arm and you push a button, that's called an automated blood pressure. So, and remember, we already learned that the name of the blood pressure cuff is a Sphygmomanometer. And there's a diagram of all the different parts of that manometer. Now, the ones that we use here are like the ones that are shown in the next slide with the little round manometer, and we read the dial as it falls down around in a counterclockwise motion. But on the next slide is something you guys might see if you go to some of your doctor's offices. Those slides or those manometers, you actually read from the top down, so it doesn't fall this way. You pump it up. You would still do this procedure the same. You would pump it up till it gets to like between 160 and 180, and as it falls, you would record where you hear it the first time, and it would continue to fall straight, and then you would record where you hear go away. So the procedure itself doesn't change. What changes is like the method, so to speak, of how you do it, and so it's really not too different. Sometimes people see that it's shaped differently and stuff, and they get a little bit concerned about it, but really there's no difference. Believe it or not, it's a really short lesson today. So that is all there is. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email, let me know, and I will see you tomorrow.